Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by former Ambassador Yoram Ettinger. Yoram, thank you for coming back to the briefing today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and my privilege to be here.
Wonderful. We have a number of important topics to discuss. Hopefully, we will get through all of them. We want to start off with talking about the way the international media is portraying what is happening now in Gaza. And of course, you have tremendous experience in that department. We want to talk a little bit about this whole issue of applying sovereignty to Judea and Samaria and the claims that it will wreak havoc to democracy in Israel because of the potential number of Arabs who would be joining the Jewish state and what exactly the implications there are. And then we want to hear a little bit about your plans in Washington, D.C. So that's our agenda. Let's start off with the media issue. What can you share with us with your experience of how the international media is treating this war in Gaza?
Well, I served for a while as the director of Israel's government press office, which is entrusted with the relations between the Israeli government and foreign media in Israel. And that experience says a lot about the manner that the media covers issues in the Middle East as a whole, Israel, and today's Gaza. And just sharing a few elements. I remember talking with a bureau chief who was a very good friend of mine during his term in Israel. And we had a dinner appointment. He was late for the dinner appointment because he spent, I'm talking about 1988, he spent a day in Gaza talking with Palestinian terrorists in Gaza. And when he shared with me the experience, he said, Yoram, this is between us. I cannot publish that, but I want you to know I spent a whole day with a leader of a terrorist group in Gaza. I was accompanied by a group of armed terrorists who led me to the hiding place of that leader. They also took me back to the border with Israel. And to be honest, I know how I am supposed to cover my visit if I want ever to be able to come back to Gaza and interview some terrorists there. And after all, this is the essence of my livelihood. I have to be able to go back, to go back. I remember talking with another bureau chief who shared with me after a few drinks he had, and therefore he was very open at that time. He shared with me experience he had in Nablus, in Samaria, and he said that he got a call from his stringer, the contact man in the area, which means a Palestinian. And the stringer told him, I got a story for you. Come with your team. So I arrived, said the bureau chief, with cameramen, with my assistant. And when the stringer saw us, the statement made by the stringer was, you will not get a story until you bring at least 2 cameras. We need good angles for the story. And I had no choice but to call Jerusalem and urge them to send me another camera because that's what the stringer want as a precondition to produce reported as if it was part of reality, which it was not. And there are many such stories, but readers and viewers should understand when Western media reports from a terrorist area, the reporters have to think first and foremost about their personal security. And personal security is guaranteed when you report so-called properly. And if you do not report properly, but realistically, you simply either won't be able to come back or if you remain in the area, you may not wake up in the following morning.
So tell me, what compels then honest, true media outlets to do this style of reporting and not share the background or not excuse themselves from those zones by just saying like we can't be honest and objective.
Well, capturing headlines and being commended for an outstanding story. By the way, there was an so-called outstanding story which was not reported, and I can divulge the name of the guy, which I usually hesitate because I think he deserves it. Thomas Friedman was the bureau chief of the New York Times when I assumed my role as a director of the government press office. Those days, there was no internet. 1988, 1989, there was no internet. There were boxes at the government press office for each foreign media outlet. And every morning, they came and picked up their envelopes, boxes, or whatever. And Thomas Friedman was on his way out. He was just completing his term in Jerusalem, and his replacement, the late Jonathan Brinkley, son of David, the legendary David Brinkley, came to replace him. And my wife and I had dinner for Jonathan Brinkley. And during dinner time, he asked me, "Have you heard what happened to Tom Friedman last night?" I said, "No, what happened?" And he said, "Well, Tom was driving on Salah ad-Din Street, which is East Jerusalem, with his wife and a child or children. I don't remember, child or children. And someone, an Arab, threw a few rocks at the car. And Tom Friedman told me," said Jonathan Brinkley, excuse me, "if I would have a gun, I would have blown the face of the SOB." Uh, the following morning, I came to my office and I was waiting for Tom Friedman to come and pick up his stuff from his New York Times box. And he arrived, and I asked Tom, "How is your wife and how is your child after this experience the other night?" And he asked me, "What experience are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, you were driving in East Jerusalem and somebody threw a rock at your car. And I wondered what happened to them." I said, "Ah, no big deal." And I said, "Tom, I think it's a big deal, which deserves a front page reference. But more importantly, you said that if you would only have a gun, you would have blown up the faces of those guys who threw rocks at you." And he said, "Damn right." And I said, "Well, don't you think you owe an apology to the Jews residing in Judea, Samaria, who carry gun, but rarely pull the trigger?" And here you were faced for the first time with something which they face every single day and don't pull the trigger, and you were ready to do what any normal human being would do: pull the trigger and blow the face of this SOB. I think they deserve an apology. And there was a smirk on his face. "Oh, come on, Yoram, you're blowing it out of proportion." But again, it's a story which he should have published, in my mind, but he also knew if he publishes such a story and issues an apology to the settlers, this may rule out future reporting by him from this area.
Now, this issue of media bias obviously doesn't just affect Israel, but all networks have bias towards all types of issues, both international and domestic. And hopefully, viewers are discerning enough to understand which networks are aligned with their views and they can trust, in which they can't. And I'm curious, in your work representing Israel, do you find that you sit down in these high stakes meetings and someone quotes something they saw in the media, and it's just you spend a lot of time dispelling, these lies, or are people discerning enough to understand that not everything they see and hear in the media is true?
Well, it seems to me from my experience that most people, public at large, reporters, people on Capitol Hill, Jewish movers and shakers, Christian movers and shakers, most people express views which they genuinely uphold. The problem is that the vast majority of people don't have the time to probe and study and investigate to find out what is true only on the surface, but has no ground in reality. What is overly simplified and what is deeply rooted in facts, or what was mentioned by certain, let's say, Palestinians, but how is that consistent or inconsistent with the way those same Palestinians walk? Palestinians are no fools. They're very, very intelligent. And when they meet Westerners, their talk is a very moderate talk. But the question is, do Westerners examine that moderate talk against the walk? And the walk, for instance, is education system. How do you, Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, how do you educate your children? How do you educate the people who come to Friday sermons in the mosque? How do you educate those who follow your official media? And are the education system and mosque sermons and media pronouncements by the Palestinians consistent with the moderate talk that you share with the U.S. Secretary of State, with the U.S. senators and U.S. congressmen? And obviously, there is a huge gap between the talk and the walk, but how many people delve into the Palestinian education system or the sermons in their mosque? I would say less than few, and that challenges each one of us who is enmeshed in the reality to educate and educate and educate, and this is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yoram, thank you. Let's now move on to issue number two I mentioned in the beginning, which is the demographic report that recently came out. And I'd love it if you could walk us through that, some of the key points, because of course, there's always this question that Israel has struggled with forever, which is if Israel were to declare sovereignty over a larger population of people who are not Jewish, who do not love the Jewish state. How does Israel maintain its Jewish identity while also being a democratic country? This is a question that has riddled us for decades, and it's partially based on demographic information that may not be true. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, demographics is one of the many examples of the difference between conventional wisdom, which is usually very simplistic. It's easy to absorb, and therefore we embrace it on the one hand, and reality, which is always much more complicated, much more complex, much more frustrating than conventional wisdom. And as you said, this has been an issue which at the top of the Jewish agenda forever. During the days of Theodor Herzl, the end of the 19th century, when Theodor Herzl summoned the first Zionist Congress, he was challenged by then the top Jewish historian, top Jewish demographer, Shimon Dubnov, who issued projections for the end of the 20th century, which basically suggested to Theodor Herzl, stop this nonsense. At best, by the end of the 20th century, there are going to be 500,000 Jews in the land of Israel. Well, slight mistake, slight error, because by the end of the 20th century, there were some 6 million Jews in the land of Israel. Prior to Ben-Gurion's the Declaration of Independence, he was approached by the top demographer statistician in Israel, the person who established the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics and established the Department of Statistics at the Hebrew University, Professor Roberto Bacchi. And Professor Roberto Bacchi issued series of projections for Ben-Gurion before Declaration of Independence, attempting to stop this voyage based on wishful thinking, according to the top statistician. And he basically said by the end of the 20th century, something like 27% Jewish minority. And both Theodor Herzl and Ben-Gurion relied much more on their own assessment of reality than on the demographers of doom. Today, just to be in touch with 2025, today, Jewish fertility rate, the number of births per woman in Israel, exceeds the Muslim fertility rate. And mind you, in the 1960s, there were 6 more babies born to average Muslim woman than Jewish woman. By 2015, that gap disappeared completely at 3.1 babies per Jewish mother and Arab mother. Today, and since 2015, every year, Jewish fertility rate has exceeded the fertility rate of Arabs in Israel, and the last 2 years, it has exceeded also the Muslim fertility rate. Not only is it higher than Arabs, Muslims west of the Jordan River, today's fertility rate, number of babies per woman in Israel, the Jewish fertility rate exceeds the fertility rate in every single Arab country other than Iraq, which is about the same as Jewish fertility rate in Israel. And to put it in very real birth terms, from 1995 until the end of 2024, the annual number of Jewish births surged by 73%. During that time, the number of Arab births from 95 through 2024 increased by 18%. Namely 73% surge of Jewish birth compared to 18% increase by Arab birth. And when it comes to Arab numbers, here again, we have to be careful and follow what I call auditing procedures to conduct due diligence, not to echo, reverberate official Palestinian numbers or Israeli numbers, but audit them. And when you audit the Palestinian numbers that claim, according to the Palestinian Authority, 3.25 million Arabs in Judea and Samaria, when you audit it, you find out that they don't necessarily lie, but they count differently. And I'm not saying that facetiously, this is a fact, and they don't hide it. They state it in press conference, they show it on their website, but when you don't conduct due diligence, how are you going to find out about it? For instance, according to the Palestinian head of the Central Bureau of Statistics, they include in their census also over 500,000 Arabs who have been away for over a year. According to international standards, you are staying away from your home country for over a year, you have to be deducted from the census because for over a year, you may have been added to the census of another country to avoid a double count. The home country deducts until you come back for over 90 days. Then we know, when I say we, the team which I represent, 3 Americans, 6 Israelis, which we have researched the issue since 2004, we conducted a debate with the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics at the Haifa Technion, the Ne'eman Institute. And during that debate, they acknowledged, the Palestinians acknowledged that their assumption of very high net immigration into the area is absolutely baseless. They accepted it. And they said, from now on, we are going to factor in zero net migration. However, our own due diligence documented major net emigration. And their response was, well, when we, the Palestinians, shall control the international passages, then we are going to indicate the actual net migration. Until then, it's zero, which means the Palestinian Authority ignores net emigration. And net emigration, since their first census, which took place in 1997, amounts to 428,000 net emigration, which is not factored in. Namely, when you take the 500,000 plus of Arabs away for over a year, plus the 428,000 net emigration, you already are almost at 1 million artificial inflation. And then you move to the 380,000 Arabs in East Jerusalem. All of them have Israeli papers. Minority are citizens, and the rest, overwhelming majority, are permanent residents of Israel, and therefore all of the 380,000 are part of the count of Israeli Arabs. However, the Palestinian Authority said, hell no, they're Palestinians. So 380,000 Arabs are doubly counted when it comes to the census of Arabs between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And then we have some 200,000 Arabs who arrived from Gaza, but mostly from Judea and Samaria, marrying Israeli Arabs. They received Israeli papers. They're counted as Israeli Arabs, but they're still part of the Palestinian census, another double count of 200,000. And then the World Bank back in 2006 found a 32% discrepancy between the number of births provided to them by the Palestinian Authority and the actual number of births, which amounts to some 250,000. Altogether, we're talking about well-documented artificial inflation of 1.75 million Arabs. And that means that we don't have 3.25 million Arabs in Judea, Samaria, but 1.5 million. We have not researched the state of demography in Gaza, but one should note that there is 100% artificial inflation in Judea and Samaria. Is that also, does that also prevail in Gaza? I don't know, but it's definitely an option.
Yoram, this is so eye-opening and enlightening. And what you're basically telling us is just like in Gaza, the Hamas health ministry inflates the amount of death, so too in the rest of Israel, the same as census keepers inflate their population. So you can basically never trust the numbers of how many have died or how many have been born. Whereas in Israel, we give tremendous, precision to every single life, and therefore want to be very accurate. We have so much more to discuss, and I want to quickly, because we've run out of time, ask you your top agenda items when you go to DC. But before I do that, I just want to share with all of our viewers that Ambassador Ettinger is a gem. And if you have the opportunity to bring him to your community, you should try your best to do that. I'm going to share his contact info in the chat right now. And anyone who wants to reach out and bring him to your community while he's on a speaking tour in the US, either now or in a future one, by all means, of course, do so. So let's just finish off. We literally have 2 minutes left. Yoram, what are your top agenda items when you go to DC right now?
Well, I've been doing it since 1989, four times a year, and always it includes about a week on Capitol Hill. And I have usually three topics. The first one is to educate or to share with legislators and their staffers the fact that Israel does not get foreign aid from the US, but the US makes an annual investment in Israel, the $3.8 billion, which yields back to the American taxpayer a very, very high return on investment, a few hundred%. The second topic, which I've been sharing with legislators and their staffers, has to do with the US policy on Iran, documenting the failure of the diplomatic option against Iran, which only provided further and further tailwind to the anti-American agenda of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the failure of economic sanctions against Iran, because as we learned from the first 4 years of President Trump, who levied maximum pressure, crippling economic sanctions, they were reversible. Came another president, and he lifted the sanctions and softened the sanction. And currently, also, President Trump may impose very rough sanctions on Iran, but they are by definition reversible. And therefore, after the failure of the diplomatic option, the failure of economic sanction, the only option left, if we want to end war and terrorism as President Trump wants, the only way is a regime change, which is going to neutralize the number one epicenter of war and terror in the region and in the globe as a whole. And last and not least, I share with legislators and their staffers, again, the facts on the ground that a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River is going to become a death sentence of the pro-Hashemite regime in Jordan, transforming Jordan into another arena of anti-American terrorism, which will create ripple effects into Egypt, into Saudi Arabia, into the UAE, undermining American interest in the region and promoting more and more anti-American terrorism, with also potential control by anti-American elements of 48% of global oil reserves.
Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.